The phone buzzed against the nightstand at 2:14 in the morning, and the sound it made was wrong somehow. Not loud, not urgent, just a single dry rattle against the wood, like something tapping on a window. I was already half awake. I'd been half awake for an hour, the way you are sometimes when sleep won't commit to you fully. My name is Daniel, and I want to tell you that I almost didn't look. I want to tell you that some part of me, some old animal instinct, knew that looking would cost me something I couldn't get back. I looked anyway. The screen lit up the dark room in pale blue, and I saw the notification banner sitting there, unhidden, undisguised, because Melissa had never once in 9 years given me a reason to think she'd hide anything from me. Tyler, don't wake him. I'll call tomorrow. I lay there for a long moment with the phone in my hand, feeling the particular stillness of a house at 2 in the morning. The refrigerator humming somewhere down the hall, Ava's nightlight throwing a thin seam of color under her door, my wife breathing slow and even beside me, her back to me, one hand curled under the pillow the way she'd slept since the day I met her. I am 36 years old. I have been married to this woman for 9 years. I have a daughter who is 6 and who believes, with the absolute conviction of a child, that her mother hung the moon personally and just hadn't gotten around to telling anyone about it. And there was a text on her phone from my best friend, telling her not to wake me up. I told myself a story right then, lying in the dark, and it's important you understand that I told myself this story instantly, automatically, the way you catch a glass before it falls off a counter. The story was, Tyler probably needs something. He's been struggling since he lost the job at the dealership. Maybe he needed to borrow money and didn't want to ask me directly, so he asked Melissa instead, because she's the soft one, the one who always says yes. It was a good story. It fit everything I already believed about my life. I am, if I'm honest with you now, a man who has always preferred a good story to an uncomfortable question. I put the phone back down exactly where it had been, screen down, the way she always left it, and I lay awake until the gray light started coming through the blinds, turning the bedroom the color of an old photograph. Cedar Falls in late October smells like wet leaves and somebody's wood stove 3 streets over. I'd lived there my whole life, except for 4 years at Iowa State. And there's a comfort in a town where you know which gas station has the good coffee and which one doesn't, where the woman at the bakery counter still calls you Han because she watched you grow up. I worked as a project manager at a regional logistics company, the kind of job where you spend your days untangling other people's scheduling disasters and feel a small, private satisfaction every time a truck arrives somewhere on time. It wasn't glamorous. It paid the mortgage on a 3-bedroom house on Birchwood Lane with a maple tree in front that turned the color of a sunset every fall, and it let me coach Ava's flag football team on Saturdays, and that had always felt like enough. Melissa worked nights, mostly, as a hospice nurse, a job I had never once managed to fully understand, not because I wasn't trying, but because I think you have to actually do it to understand what it costs a person to sit with the dying for a living. She'd come home some mornings with a particular kind of quiet on her, a quiet I'd learned not to interrupt, and I'd make coffee and not ask questions and tell myself I was being respectful of her process. That was one of my better qualities. I'd always believed I didn't pry. I gave people room. It would take me a long time to understand that giving someone room and refusing to look at them are not always the same kindness. Tyler Brooks had been my best friend since our sophomore year at Iowa State, when we'd ended up as roommates by pure dormitory lottery and discovered we both hated the same professor and loved the same terrible pizza place on University Avenue. He was the kind of friend who showed up, flat tire at 1 a.m., moving day, the year my father died, and I couldn't get out of bed for 3 days and Tyler just sat in my living room, not saying anything useful, just being there. He'd been best man at my wedding. He called Melissa Mel in a way nobody else did, a familiarity I'd never thought twice about, because why would I? He was mine first, in the old uncomplicated way men have of believing their friends belong to a separate category of trust entirely, immune to the ordinary risks. He'd lost his sales job at the Chevy dealership in June, 6 months back, and since then he'd been drifting, picking up odd work, talking about exploring his options, sleeping later and later. I'd lent him $400 in August without telling Melissa, because that's what you do for your best friend, and I hadn't thought about it since. That morning, the morning after the text, I made coffee at 6 the way I always did, and Melissa came down at 6:30 in her robe, hair still damp from a shower, and kissed the top of my head on her way to the coffee pot, and said, "Ava up yet?" "Not yet," I said. And then, because some compulsion in me wanted to test the story I'd told myself, wanted it confirmed out loud so I could stop thinking about it. "Tyler texted you last night? Saw it light up your phone around 2. She didn't flinch. That's the thing I'd replay later. There was no flinch, no missed beat, nothing a careful observer would have caught. She poured her coffee, leaned against the counter, and said, "Oh, yeah, he was having a meltdown about the job thing again. I told him we'd talk today." A small, tired smile. "He's having a rough patch. You could have woken me. I would have talked to him." "You were sleeping," she said. "And honestly, Dan, sometimes I think he just needs to vent to someone who isn't going to try to fix it. You always want to fix it." She said this lightly, almost fondly, like it was an old joke between us, and it landed exactly the way she intended it to land, as a compliment wrapped around a small, reasonable boundary. I am a fixer. Everyone in my life has always told me so. It is supposedly one of my best qualities. I let it go. I want you to notice that I let it go, because that decision, small, forgettable, utterly reasonable in the moment, was the first stone in a wall I would spend the next several weeks building without realizing it. Ava came downstairs in mismatched socks, demanding waffles, and the morning swallowed the conversation whole, and I went to work. And somewhere underneath the part of my mind that was thinking about delivery schedules and quarterly numbers, a much smaller part of me had quietly filed away the phrase "don't wake him" and was not going to forget it, no matter how hard the rest of me tried to. Life has a way of disguising the unraveling of things as the continuation of things, and that's exactly what the next 3 weeks felt like. Ordinary, almost aggressively ordinary. The kind of ordinary you only recognize as strange once you know what was actually happening underneath it. Melissa's hospice schedule had her working 4 nights a week, sometimes 5, 12-hour shifts that left her sleeping through most mornings while I got Ava ready for school. This had always been our rhythm. I'd never questioned it because it had simply always been true, like the maple tree out front or the way the floor creaked in the upstairs hallway. But that November, I started noticing, not suspecting, just noticing, the way you notice a new crack in a ceiling without yet wondering what's pulling the house apart. That her shifts seemed to be shifting. A scheduled night off became a favor for Renata. She's got a family thing. A morning she usually slept until 11. She was up and showered by 9, dressed, gone by 9:30, back by noon with a story about errands that didn't quite map onto the bag she came home with, or didn't come home with. I noticed her phone face down more often. I want to be honest with you and say that I noticed it the way you notice weather. Present, real, not yet alarming. Melissa had never been a phone-down kind of person before. She left it on the counter, screen up, password known to both of us since the day we got engaged. Sometime in early November, it started living face down on whatever surface was nearest her. Once I picked it up to move it so I could wipe the counter, and she crossed the kitchen faster than the moment required and took it from my hand. Not grabbed. Exactly. Just intercepted, smooth, smiling. "I've got it," she said, and put it in her robe pocket. I didn't ask why. This is the part one keep returning to, even now. I had 100 small openings to ask why, and I walked past every one of them like a man avoiding eye contact with a stranger on the street, because some part of me had already decided that asking would require dealing with whatever answer came back, and dealing with things was not, historically, my strongest instinct. I am, and this is the part of myself I had the least practice looking at, a man who would rather live inside an unconfirmed fear for months than risk turning it into a confirmed fact for one terrible afternoon. Tyler started coming around more. He'd always been a fixture, dropping by on weekends, staying for a beer and a football game. But that fall he started showing up on weeknights too, usually around the time Melissa was getting ready for a shift, usually leaving not long after she did. Just checking in. He'd say, settling onto our couch like he'd lived there once, which in a sense, in our friendship's long history, he sort of had. He'd ask about Ava, ask about work, complain in his easy, self-deprecating way about the job hunt, and I never once thought to ask myself why a grown man with his own apartment kept finding reasons to visit a married friend's house specifically around the hours his wife was leaving it. There's a particular Tuesday I keep coming back to. Melissa had a half-day shift starting at 4, and Tyler showed up around 3, supposedly to return a drill he'd borrowed 2 months earlier. He stood in the kitchen doorway while Melissa finished getting dressed upstairs, and there was a strange charge in the room, a kind of held breath, and I attributed it. I remember doing this consciously, to the fact that Tyler was embarrassed about his job situation and didn't like talking about it in front of people, even me. When Melissa came down, dressed for work, she and Tyler exchanged a look that I clocked, and then immediately filed under their close. They've always been close. That's not new. It wasn't a long look. It wasn't dramatic. It was just slightly too long for a borrowed drill. "You guys good?" I asked, because some instinct in me wanted the question asked even if I didn't want the answer examined. "Yeah," Melissa said, grabbing her keys. "Tyler was just telling me about an interview he's got next week." She kissed me on the cheek, quick, the way she always did before a shift, and was gone. And Tyler stayed another 20 minutes talking about a job at a logistics warehouse 2 towns over. And I remember feeling, underneath the conversation, a strange flatness in my own chest that I couldn't name and didn't try very hard to. That same week, Ava asked me at dinner, apropos of nothing, the way kids ask things that adults have spent considerable energy trying not to ask themselves. "Why does Uncle Tyler come over when mommy's leaving and not when she's home?" I laughed it off. "He probably just likes timing it that way, buddy. Coincidence." Ava shrugged and went back to her macaroni, the question already forgotten by her, 6 years old and free of the particular adult talent for retaining and reburying inconvenient information. I was not free of it. I carried that sentence around with me for 2 days like a stone in my shoe before I managed to convince myself it meant nothing. Money started feeling strange too, in a way I noticed before I understood. I handled our joint checking account, mostly, paid the mortgage and the utilities out of it, while Melissa kept a separate personal account from her nursing income. Standard, normal, something we'd set up years ago without much discussion. But that November, I noticed 2 withdrawals from the joint account, $200 each, cash, that she hadn't mentioned. When I brought it up, casually, over dishes one night, she said, "Oh, I gave Tyler a little help. He's behind on his car payment, and I didn't want to make a big thing out of it with you. You already lent him money in August." She said this with a kind of weary patience, like I was the one being unreasonable for noticing $400 leave our account. "He's embarrassed enough, Dan. Let's not turn it into a thing." "I just wish you'd told me," I said. "I'm telling you now." She didn't look up from the sink. I didn't think it needed a whole conversation. I let that go too. I told myself this was generosity, the same generosity that made her good at her job, good at sitting with dying strangers and holding their hands when their own families couldn't manage it. I told myself I was lucky to be married to someone with that kind of heart, and that a man who questioned every kindness his wife extended to his oldest friend was a small, suspicious sort of man I didn't want to become. Underneath all of it, though, underneath the ordinary dinners and the ordinary school pickups and the ordinary Sunday football games where Tyler sat in his usual spot on our couch, like nothing in the world had shifted, something in me had started keeping score without my permission. I didn't call it suspicion yet. I called it noticing. But I was noticing constantly, and a man who notices constantly is a man already bracing for something, whether he admits it to himself or not. By the first week of December, the noticing had curdled into something I could no longer pretend was passive observation. It started, oddly enough, with a perfume. Melissa had worn the same scent for years, something light and citrusy that she bought from the same drugstore brand, because she said expensive perfume gave her headaches during long shifts. One Thursday morning, helping her zip a sweater that had gotten stuck, I caught a different smell on the collar, something heavier, warmer, almost spiced, nothing like what sat on her dresser. I didn't say anything. I just stood there for a second with my fingers on the zipper, and she turned around and said, "What?" in a voice that was a half degree too quick, too bright. "Nothing," I said. "Static cling." She laughed, a little too easily, and went to find her shoes, and I stood in our bedroom feeling something open up in my chest that I would later recognize as the actual beginning, not of the affair, which had clearly begun before this, but of my own knowing. Some part of me had crossed a line that morning from not asking to actively avoiding finding out, and those are very different postures, even if from the outside they look identical. I started watching her phone, not searching it. Not yet. I want to be precise about this because precision matters and because I wasn't proud of even the watching. I watched where it sat, how quickly she reached for it when it buzzed, The way her thumb moved fast and practiced when she dismissed a notification before I could see the sender's name. One Saturday afternoon, doing laundry, I found a receipt in the pocket of her scrub pants from a coffee shop downtown, Java Junction, a place neither of us frequented, dated for a Tuesday. She'd told me she was running errands during a stretch she should have been sleeping off a night shift. 2 coffees. 2 pastries. I held that receipt in my hand for a long time, standing over the washing machine, feeling something I can only describe as a kind of vertigo. The specific dizziness of realizing the floor you've been standing on was never quite as solid as you'd believed. I put the receipt back in the pocket. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being paranoid, that 2 coffees didn't mean anything, that maybe she'd run into a colleague. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe. I built an entire cathedral of maybes that month, and I lived inside it because the alternative was unbearable to look at directly. Tyler's visits kept happening, but something in his manner had changed too, something I clocked without naming. He used to be loose around me, easy, the same guy he'd always been. Now there was a particular carefulness to him. He laughed a beat too long at my jokes. He asked about my work with a thoroughness that felt rehearsed, like a man performing the role of attentive friend rather than simply being one. Once, helping me move a bookshelf in the garage, he said, apropos of nothing, "You know I'd never do anything to mess up what you've got here, right, Dan? You and Mel and Ava, you guys have a good thing." I remember laughing and saying, "Where's this coming from?" And he shrugged and said something about his own divorced parents, about appreciating good marriages when he saw them. And I believed him, because believing him cost me nothing in that moment, and the alternative cost me everything. Mid-December, Melissa's co-worker Renata, a heavy-set, warm woman who'd been to our house for Christmas parties, who I genuinely liked, called our home phone by mistake one evening, looking for Melissa about a shift swap. "Isn't she with you guys tonight?" I thought she said she was staying in. I told Renata that Melissa had said she was covering a shift for someone, and there was a small, telling pause on the line before Renata said, carefully, "Oh, maybe I'm thinking of the wrong week. My bad, Dan." She hung up quickly. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone, feeling the particular cold that comes when a stranger's small mistake briefly opens a door you weren't supposed to see through. When Melissa came home that night, I asked her, as casually as I could manage, "Did you swap shifts with Renata or something? She called looking for you tonight." There was a pause, barely a beat, but I caught it. The way you catch the half-second hesitation before someone lies who isn't naturally good at lying. Oh, God, that's so embarrassing. I forgot to tell her I picked up a private shift instead. A hospice family asked for me specifically. "I'll call her tomorrow and clear it up." She said this while taking off her shoes, not looking at me, and it was a perfectly reasonable explanation, fully formed, requiring no further questions, and that was exactly what unsettled me about it. How complete it was. How ready, like she'd had it prepared in case this exact gap ever needed filling. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to her in the dark, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, and I thought about the text from October, "Don't wake him," and the perfume, and the coffee receipt, and Renata's careful retreat on the phone, and Ava's offhand question about Uncle Tyler's timing. And I felt all of these separate small things arrange themselves, for the first time, into something with a shape. I didn't have proof. I want to be honest that what I had was a feeling, a terrible accumulating feeling, the kind that doesn't announce itself as certainty, but sits in your stomach like a stone you swallowed without meaning to. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 9 years of marriage. I picked up Melissa's phone while she was in the shower, thumbed in the passcode I'd known since we got engaged, half expecting it to have been changed. It hadn't been changed. That, somehow, hurt in its own small way. That she hadn't even thought she needed to hide it from me, that I was that far outside her calculations. There wasn't much. A text thread with Tyler, mostly mundane, logistics about times, a joke about a TV show, nothing overtly damning. But there was one message, sent the previous Tuesday, the day of the Java Junction receipt, that read, "Can't stop thinking about this morning." And her reply, 3 words, "Me neither." Careful. I stood in our bedroom holding her phone, hearing the shower running down the hall, and I felt something in my chest cave in slowly, like a structure that had been compromised for a long time finally giving way. Not an explosion, just a quiet, internal collapse, the kind nobody else in the house could have heard. I put the phone back exactly where it had been and went downstairs and made coffee with hands that were not entirely steady. And when Melissa came down 20 minutes later, dressed for the day, she kissed my cheek and asked what was wrong. And I said, nothing. Didn't sleep great. And she said, poor thing, and touched my arm. And I stood there in my own kitchen, in my own life, feeling like a man watching a movie of himself from somewhere just outside his body. I will tell you something I'm not proud of. Once I'd seen that text, the part of me that had spent 2 months avoiding certainty flipped entirely into needing it, completely, urgently, like a man who's been thirsty for so long he no longer knows how to drink slowly. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I told myself this was strategy, that I needed the full picture before I said anything, that a partial accusation would only let her tighten up her story, give her time to cover tracks. I think that was true, partly. But I also think, looking back, that some part of me was still hoping I'd find something that explained the text away, some context that turned can't stop thinking about this morning into something other than what it plainly was. I was a man building a case against my own hope. I started checking the joint bank statements with new eyes. Buried in November's transactions, I found a charge from a place called the Riverside Inn, out on Highway 20, dated for a Tuesday, one of Melissa's private hospice shift days. $41, paid in cash supplemented by a small card charge, the kind of charge that wouldn't raise a flag unless you were looking, specifically, for exactly this kind of thing. I looked up the Riverside Inn. It was a roadside motel, the kind with hourly parking spaces angled toward each room door, the kind nobody stays at for a vacation. I sat with that receipt for 2 days before I did anything else, turning it over in my mind, trying to find an explanation that wasn't the obvious one. I genuinely tried. I am, even now, someone who would rather construct an elaborate alternate explanation than accept a simple ugly one. And I spent real hours of my life that week imagining scenarios where my wife had a reason to be at a roadside motel that had nothing to do with Tyler, with betrayal, with the unraveling of everything I'd built my life around. I went to Tyler's apartment on a Thursday evening, ostensibly to return a tool, and I want to tell you honestly that some part of me went there hoping he'd say something, do something, that would make this all collapse back into innocence. He answered the door in sweatpants, looking tired, and let me in, and we sat in his cramped living room with a basketball game playing low on the TV, and I watched him the entire time the way I'd never watched him before, not as my friend, but as a man being studied for tells. "You good, man?" he asked at one point. "You seem off." "Just work stuff," I said. "You talk to Mel much?" Something flickered across his face. Not panic, exactly, but a recalculation, a man adjusting his footing on ground he'd thought was stable. "Here and there," he said. "She checks in on me. You know how she is." "Yeah," I said. "I know how she is." I left 20 minutes later, having learned nothing concrete and everything I needed to know in the only way that mattered. In the way his eyes wouldn't quite hold mine. In the careful neutrality of his voice. In the fact that a man with nothing to hide doesn't recalculate his footing when you ask an ordinary question about your own wife. That weekend, I made a decision that still sits uneasily with me, even now, even knowing everything I know. I put a small voice-activated recorder, the kind meant for dictating notes, nothing sophisticated, in the console of Melissa's car, tucked under a stack of napkins, on a Tuesday morning before she left for what she'd told me was a private shift. I am not telling you this to justify it. I'm telling you because it happened, and because the truth of what came next depends on you understanding exactly how far I'd already traveled from the man who, 2 months earlier, hadn't even wanted to ask about a 2 a.m. text. The recording, when I played it back that night in the garage with the door shut and the radio in my truck turned up loud enough to cover any sound, was 11 minutes long, most of it silence and engine noise and a country song on the radio. But there was a phone call, hands-free, for minutes in. Tyler's voice, tinny through the car speakers. "We need to talk about this. I can't keep doing the disappearing act every time Dan's around." And Melissa, her voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. Almost a whisper even though she was alone in the car. I know. Just, not yet. Not like this. Let me figure out how to do this right. Do this right." I sat in my garage with those 3 words circling in my skull, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its terribleness, that this was not a fling, not a one-time lapse she was already regretting. This was something with a shape, something she was actively managing, planning, weighing how to do right, and the casualness of that phrase, as though there were a correct procedure for dismantling a marriage, broke something in me that I don't think fully reassembled for a long time afterward. There was something else, too, something I almost missed in the 11 minutes, a moment near the end, just before she pulled into a parking lot, where her voice changed entirely, dropped into something rawer, almost talking to herself. I used to be somebody before all this. I don't even know when I disappeared. It wasn't said to Tyler. The call had already ended. She said it to no one, to the windshield, to herself, and there was something in the way she said it that didn't fit the rest of what I'd heard. Something that sounded less like guilt and more like grief, and it confused me in a way the rest of the recording hadn't, because it didn't fit the villain I was busy constructing in my head, and I didn't know, yet, what to do with a piece of evidence that complicated the story instead of confirming it. I gathered more over the following 2 weeks. Not recordings again. I couldn't bring myself to do that twice. It had felt like a violation even as I told myself it was justified. But documents. I printed the bank statements, highlighted the Riverside in charges, 3 of them total across 6 weeks. I found a second receipt, this one from a jewelry kiosk at the mall, a cheap bracelet, paid cash, that I never saw on her wrist and never found in her drawers, which told me exactly where it had ended up and exactly who had likely given it. I screenshotted the text thread on her phone one more time, this time copying the messages in full onto my own phone, dates and timestamps included, my hands shaking the entire time I did it, terrified she'd wake up, terrified of what I was turning myself into, and unable to stop. By the 3rd week of December, I had a folder. An actual physical folder, manila, sitting in the bottom drawer of my desk in the garage, containing printed bank statements, a photograph I'd taken of the bracelet kiosk receipt, transcribed text messages, and a single page where I'd written out, in my own handwriting, a timeline, dates, locations, the October text that started it all. I hadn't told anyone. Not my brother, not my own parents, no one. I carried the entire weight of what I knew through 3 weeks of Christmas decorations and Ava's school pageant, and Tyler sitting on our couch on a Sunday afternoon eating chili I'd made, laughing at something on the TV, and I sat across from him in my own living room and felt a hatred so total and so quiet that it frightened me more than anything Melissa had done. I decided I would confront her after the holidays. Not out of mercy. I want to be honest about that. But because some calculating part of me had decided that Ava deserved one more normal Christmas before her entire understanding of her family detonated, and because I needed those extra days to figure out exactly how I wanted to do this. I had the evidence. What I didn't yet have was the slightest idea of what I was going to do with it, or with the 9 years it was about to unmake. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday in early January, 3 days after Ava went back to school, in the late afternoon when the light outside had already gone the flat gray-blue of a Midwest winter dusk. I had taken the day off work, told Melissa I had a dentist appointment. She'd worked the night before and slept until 1, and I waited until she was awake, dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, before I came in and set the manila folder down in front of her, unopened, and sat across from her without saying anything at first. "What's this?" she asked, and there was something already shifting in her face. Not panic yet, but a kind of bracing, the look of someone who has been waiting for a particular knock on a particular door for a long time and has finally heard it. "Open it," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I had practiced this moment in my head so many times over the holidays that some part of me was almost relieved to finally be inside it instead of dreading it from outside. She opened the folder slowly. I watched her go through it. The bank statements with the Riverside in charges circled in red, the bracelet receipt, the printed texts, the handwritten timeline. Her face didn't crumble the way I think I'd half expected, half hoped it would. It went still instead, carefully still, like a woman holding her breath underwater. "Here's what I know," I said, and I kept my voice level, because I had decided, somewhere in the long nights of December, that I was not going to give her the satisfaction of watching me fall apart before I even had answers. "I know about the Riverside Inn. 3 times in November and December. I know about the texts. I know about the bracelet you never wore. I know what 'do this right' means, Melissa, because I heard you say it." I watched that land. Watched her register that I'd recorded her, and something flickered across her face that might have been the first real crack, but she closed it down fast. "You went through my phone," she said. "You put something in my car." Her voice had gone sharp, defensive, finding its first foothold not in denial of the affair, but in outrage at how I'd uncovered it. "Do you understand how insane that is? You've been spying on me for weeks." "Don't," I said. "Don't make this about how I found out. I'm not saying it isn't true that." She stopped herself, started again. "I'm saying you violated my privacy in a way that's honestly terrifying, Dan. You bugged my car like I'm a criminal. Are you going to tell me it's not true?" A pause. Her hands were flat on the table, on either side of the folder, and I watched her decide, in real time, which version of the next few minutes she was going to try to build. "It's not what you think it is," she said finally. "Tyler and I have been close, yes. Closer than maybe I should have let it get. But this," she gestured at the folder, "this is you taking a few coincidences and building a whole story around them. A motel charge isn't a coincidence. I went there once to talk to him privately because he was having a breakdown about his divorce and his parents, and he didn't want to fall apart somewhere public. That's it." Her voice was steady now, rehearsed sounding in a way that made my skin go cold. "You're acting like I had an affair because you found a receipt and a text message that you're reading into way more than it means." "3 receipts," I said, sliding them toward her. "Not one." She looked at them for a long moment. "Fine. A few times. We talked. It wasn't. Dan, it wasn't what you're imagining." "Then what was it?" "It was complicated," she said. And there it was, the word I would come to despise more than any other in this entire ordeal. The word that asks you to do the work of softening something that does not deserve softening. You weren't around emotionally the way you think you were. You go to work, you come home, you fix things around the house, you coach Ava's team, and you think that's enough, and maybe it is enough for some people. But I've been disappearing in this house for years, and you never noticed because you weren't looking. Don't turn this into something I did. I'm not saying it justifies anything," she said quickly, too quickly, the kind of fast walk-back people do when they've heard themselves and realized how it sounded. "I'm saying there's context you're refusing to see." I felt something in my chest pulling tighter and tighter, a wire being wound, but I kept my voice flat, because flat was the only thing keeping me upright. "Was it physical?" She didn't answer right away. "Does it matter at this point what label we put on it?" "Yes," I said. "It matters to me enormously." "Once," she said finally, looking at the table, not at me. "Twice. It wasn't, Dan, it wasn't some great romance. It was 2 people who were both lonely in different ways finding something that felt easier than what we had at home." "Don't say we." "I wasn't lonely. I was married." "You think I wasn't?" Her voice cracked there, the first real crack in the composure, but she caught it fast, swallowed it down. "You think 9 years of being the person who holds everyone together, you, Ava, my patients, their families, you think that's not its own kind of lonely?" I want to tell you that I had a perfect response to that. I didn't. I sat there with the folder between us and felt, for the first time since October, something other than anger, something closer to grief, because some small, stubborn part of me had hoped, even walking into this conversation with a folder full of proof, that there would be an explanation that didn't reduce 9 years to this. There wasn't one. There was just a woman across the table from me, minimizing, reframing, shrinking the thing down to a size she could survive saying out loud, and a man who had just heard the word twice and didn't believe it for a single second. "How long?" I said. "It's not," she started. "How long, Melissa?" She looked at me then, really looked, and something in her face shifted. Not collapse, not yet, but a kind of exhausted recalculation, the look of someone realizing the careful walls she'd built were not, in fact, holding. "Since September," she said quietly. "It started in September. For months. Not once or twice. For months of Tuesdays in motel rooms, and a text at 2 in the morning that I'd lain awake beside and told myself a story about. 'I need you to leave,' I said. My voice didn't shake, which surprised me more than anything else that happened that day. 'Tonight. I'll figure out what to tell Ava. But I need you out of this house tonight.' 'Dan.' 'Tonight,' I said again, and stood up and walked out to the garage and sat in my truck in the cold with the engine off for 40 minutes, not crying. Not yet, just sitting very still, the way you sit still after an accident before you know yet how badly you're hurt. Melissa left that night and stayed at her sister's apartment across town. I told Ava, the next morning, in the gentlest version of the truth I could manage, that mommy and daddy needed some time apart to figure some things out, and Ava, with the terrible perceptiveness of 6-year-olds, asked if it was because of Uncle Tyler, and I had to sit on the edge of her bed for a long minute before I could answer her. Because some part of me hadn't realized until that exact moment how much my daughter had already been quietly cataloging the same small wrongnesses I had. Tyler called me 4 times over the following week. I didn't answer any of them. He sent one text. I know I don't deserve to say this, but I'm sorry. You were my best friend, and I stared at it for a long time before deleting it without responding, because there are some apologies that don't require an answer to be heard. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Melissa asked to come back to the house to talk. Not to move back in, just to talk. And I let her, because Ava needed to see her parents in the same room without it being a battlefield. And because, underneath everything, some part of me still wanted to understand, not to forgive necessarily, but to understand, the way you want to understand the mechanics of any disaster that's happened to you. We sat in the living room, the same room where Tyler had eaten chili on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks before everything came apart, and Melissa asked if she could say something without me interrupting until she was finished. I said yes. I need you to actually hear this, she said. And I'm not telling you to make myself feel better, because nothing about saying this out loud feels good. It really started, the actual turning point, on a Tuesday morning in early September. I'd just come off a 13-hour shift where I held a woman's hand while she died because her own daughter couldn't make it there in time, and I came home, and the house was empty because you'd already left for work and Ava was at school, and I sat on the kitchen floor, not even the chair, the floor, and I cried for 40 minutes about a woman I'd known for 6 weeks, and there was nobody there to see it. And I remember thinking, with this terrible clarity, nobody in my life actually sees me anymore. I am infrastructure. I am the thing that keeps the house running. And Tyler called that afternoon, just to vent about his own stuff, the way he always did, and somewhere in that conversation I told him about the woman who died, and he just listened, really listened, the way it felt like nobody had in years. And I told myself, that day, that it was nothing, just a friend being a friend. That's the lie I told myself first, that listening to me wasn't crossing anything. The next time we met for coffee, 2 weeks later, he touched my hand on the table, just for a second, and I let it sit there a beat too long before I moved it. And I told myself that was nothing too, that noticing the warmth of someone's hand isn't the same as wanting it. I kept telling myself smaller and smaller lies until I'd built a staircase out of them without realizing each step was taking me somewhere I couldn't get back from. By the time we were at the riverside in the first time, I'd already crossed so many small lines that the big one almost didn't feel like a separate decision. It felt like the next stair in a staircase I'd already been climbing for a month. I was terrified the entire time, Dan. I want you to know that, even though I know it doesn't make it better. I was terrified every single time, checking my phone for your calls, rehearsing explanations in the car before I even pulled into the driveway, watching myself become a person I genuinely didn't recognize, someone who lied easily, who'd gotten good at it, who could look you in the eye over dinner 40 minutes after leaving a motel room and ask Ava about her spelling test like nothing had happened. I couldn't look at the drawing Ava made of our family that's still on the fridge, the one with all 4 stick figures and the dog we don't even have. I'd walk past it and physically look away every single day for months. There was a night in November I almost told you. You were doing dishes and you said something completely ordinary. You said, "You've seemed tired lately. You okay?" And it nearly broke me open right there at the sink, because you were being kind. You were noticing the exact thing I'd convinced myself you never did anymore. And I opened my mouth to say something, and what came out instead was just tired from work, because I was a coward. And because some part of me had already decided that telling you would cost more than I was ready to pay. And I hated myself walking up the stairs that night more than I've hated myself for almost anything else in my life. I don't have an ending where I tell you I was about to stop on my own. I wasn't. I think, left alone, I would have kept finding reasons to keep doing this and keep telling myself smaller lies about it. And that's the most honest and the most shameful thing I can tell you. You finding that recorder, finding those statements, some terrible part of me was almost relieved because it meant I didn't have to be the one to stop it. You stopped it for me. I sat through all of it without interrupting, exactly as I'd promised, and when she finished, the living room was very quiet, just the sound of the furnace kicking on somewhere in the walls. I didn't say anything for a long time. I don't think I can come back from 4 months, I finally said. I believe everything you just told me. I think it's the most honest you've been with me in a long time. But believing you doesn't undo it. She nodded, like she'd expected exactly this. Like some part of her had already grieved the marriage before she ever sat down to confess to it. I know, she said quietly. I'm not asking you to undo it. I just needed you to actually know. We filed for divorce in February. It was, by the ugly standards of these things, relatively quiet. No court battle, a custody arrangement we worked out between us with a mediator over 3 sessions, Ava splitting weeks between 2 houses 6 blocks apart, so her school and her friends stayed the same, even while everything else rearranged itself. Tyler moved to Des Moines that spring. I heard, secondhand, through a mutual friend, that he and Melissa hadn't stayed in contact, that whatever they'd had hadn't survived being seen in daylight, which didn't surprise me and didn't comfort me either. There was a moment, maybe 4 months after the divorce was finalized, when Melissa asked, carefully, almost shyly, nothing like the composed woman who'd minimized a 4-month affair down to once or twice back in January, whether there was any chance, someday, of finding our way back to each other. We were standing in my driveway, dropping Ava off after a weekend at her place, and the maple tree was just starting to bud. No, I said, and I said it gently, because there was no anger left in me by then, just a kind of settled clarity. I don't think there is. I've thought about it, and I think the version of trust we'd need to rebuild this is gone, not because I want to punish you, but because it's actually gone. I don't think I'd ever stop watching you for the next lie, even if there wasn't one. That's not a marriage. That's a surveillance operation with a wedding ring. She nodded, and there were tears in her eyes that she didn't try to hide, and she said, okay, and got in her car, and that was, more or less, the last real conversation we had that wasn't strictly about Ava's school schedule or summer camp logistics. Looking back now, I can see the red flags lined up like streetlights on a road I drove down too many times to claim I never saw them. The 2 a.m. text that asked me not to be woken, that was never really about letting me sleep. It was the first small rehearsal of a much larger habit, keeping me unconscious to things that mattered. I called it respect at the time. I wouldn't call it that anymore. The face-down phone, the perfume that didn't match her dresser, Renata's careful retreat on the phone. I'd noticed every single one of them in real time, and I'd let each one slide past, because confronting any single piece would have required confronting the whole shape they were quietly assembling into. And I have spent most of my adult life being far more comfortable with an unconfirmed fear than a confirmed fact. I think the real turning point wasn't the recorder or the Riverside and receipts, or even the text from October. It was the moment, much earlier, when I decided that giving Melissa room, not asking, not pushing, not making her explain herself, was the same thing as trusting her. It wasn't. It was avoidance wearing the costume of respect, and I'd been doing it for years before Tyler ever entered the picture, in smaller ways, about smaller things, and I think some part of her loneliness that she described, the sense of disappearing inside the role of holding everyone together, grew, at least partly, in the space I left empty by never asking how she actually was, only assuming that because the house ran smoothly, she must be fine inside it. That doesn't make what she did my fault. I want to be completely clear about that, because I spent some genuinely unproductive weeks in February trying to reverse engineer my own guilt into a tidy explanation for her choices, and a friend finally told me, bluntly, that a man being imperfectly attentive does not obligate his wife to drive to a motel on Highway 20. She made every one of those choices herself, deliberately, dozens of times across 4 months, each one a separate decision to keep going rather than stop. But I also can't pretend my own blind spot. The comfort I took in not looking too closely at anything, the way I'd built an entire identity around being easy, undemanding, low maintenance, didn't help carve out the space where all of this had room to grow undisturbed for as long as it did. I think about Ava's question that fall, the one I laughed off at the dinner table. Why does Uncle Tyler come over when Mommy's leaving and not when she's home? And I think about how a 6-year-old noticed the pattern faster than I let myself admit it, simply because she hadn't yet learned the adult habit of talking herself out of what's right in front of her. What stays with me most, even now, isn't the betrayal itself. Betrayals, I've come to understand, are almost always some combination of opportunity, loneliness, and a moment where someone chooses themselves over a promise they made. What stays with me is how ordinary the unraveling felt while it was happening. There was no single dramatic scene, no moment where the music swells and everyone understands what's at stake. It was a text at 2 in the morning that I almost didn't look at. It was a perfume I noticed and dismissed as static cling. It was a friend who started laughing a half-second too long at my jokes. Betrayal, in my experience, doesn't announce itself. It accumulates in small, deniable pieces, and it survives specifically because each individual piece is too small to justify the discomfort of asking about it. I've also come to think differently about Melissa's loneliness, the thing she described sitting on the kitchen floor after a 13-hour shift, certain that nobody actually saw her anymore. I don't think that feeling justified anything she did, but I no longer think it was nothing, either, or simply an excuse she constructed after the fact to make herself feel better. I think a lot of marriages quietly hollow out exactly that way, not through some single dramatic failure, but through years of two people functioning well enough as a household that neither one notices the actual connection thinning out underneath the functioning. We paid the mortgage. We coordinated the school pickups. We rarely, if ever, asked each other how we were actually doing underneath all of it. If there's a single question I'd ask anyone listening to this, it's not, would you have noticed sooner than I did? It's simpler than that. When was the last time you actually asked the person you love how they're doing, and then sat still long enough, without trying to fix anything, to actually hear the answer? I used to think love showed up in the big gestures, showing up for the flat tire, showing up at the hospital, showing up at the funeral. I still believe that's true, but I think now that it also has to show up in the small, unglamorous moments of actually looking at someone closely enough to notice when they've started to disappear. I didn't do that. Not because I didn't love her, because I convinced myself that not looking too closely was its own quiet form of love, and I was wrong about that, and it cost me almost everything I had. I don't know what Melissa would tell you if you asked her about whether she'd do it differently given the chance. I only know what I would tell you, and it's this. Pay attention to the 2 texts. Pay attention to the perfume that doesn't match the dresser. The truth was never actually hidden from me. I just spent 5 months choosing not to look directly at it, and by the time I finally did, it had already grown into something none of us could undo.